Hello and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, I cover a whole range of content, particularly on current affairs. So please do subscribe and feel free to share the content. I'll get straight into this. I want to lay out some of my views on the campus protests regarding, that is, the pro-Palestinian campus protests across the United States. I'm going to kind of divide the video partly looking at that and also more about some of the implications as to how people are, I guess, pigeonholed regarding this conflict, the war in the Near East. So there's quite a lot to break down, so bear with me. These protests have been going on obviously since the start of the war, but they've kind of escalated in recent weeks because there's been a number of run-ins with law enforcement and the protesters. And as always, we hear this narrative, peaceful protest. Well, what I would say about that is it really, really depends on context, because I do think that the mere absence of violence doesn't represent peace. If you are stopping other students getting to their studies, if you're stopping other students, getting to class, if you're pitching up tents, trespassing, it may not be violent, but it's not necessarily peaceful either. It's a disruptive act. Um, and with any protest, regardless of the issue, I think that protesters, activists need to be responsible. Now, there was some dramatic scenes from Emory University in Decatur, Georgia, in which the police moved in. I thought it seemed a bit heavy-handed, but again, context is very important here. Apparently, the university itself had contacted law enforcement. They said these people were trespassing. They weren't part of the faculty. The protests, I understand, began at Columbia University in New York City. They spread all over the country. Um, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of overlap with what the students are talking about regarding pro-Palestinian issues and other left-wing issues like Black Lives Matter and trans rights and what have you. But thinking specifically about this issue, my question is, what are they doing in terms of, are they simply expressing the First Amendment rights, or are they crossing a line? Now, if they're harassing fellow students, if they're preventing faculty members and other students going about their business, then I would say they are crossing a line. I think there's real echoes here of the events of 1968 outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago that year, the infamous DNC, where there was violence. In 1968 again, it was levelled against the Democratic Party, Lyndon Johnson and presidential nominee Hubert Humphrey. In 2024, the anger is directed against Biden and Blinken. This actually affects Trump less, because Trump doesn't need to pitch to his base in the way Biden does. Young Republicans don't care in that way about the Palestinians. So this isn't the same issue for Trump. It is a big headache for Biden. And I think that even though he's criticised Israel, even though he and Blinken have both expressed concern at the situation, they are inevitably tied with Israeli policy. I think it was very foolish early on, and I think Blinken's a smart man, but I think early on it was very foolish to say, as far as the US was concerned, there was no red lines. That's absurd, because they can't be sure how a conflict will play out. So let's say, 20 Americans are killed in an Israeli airstrike. Are they still going to say there's no red lines regarding funding for Israel? That was a stupid statement to make from the State Department early on. There's anger in this country as well against the Sunak government and against Keir Starmer. The issue for Starmer is somewhat similar to Biden. He's a left-wing politician, and this is one of those big grassroots issues. So regarding the protests themselves, my issue is, are there lines being crossed, or is it police heavy-handedness? I do think that there is some US law enforcement that are a bit heavy-handed. The use of tasers needs to be in exceptional circumstances. I do find it a bit concerning, the reports of rubber bullets being used, and there's a real risk that there could be a repeat of like the Kent State massacre, which happened in 1970, I believe. in the US. So there is a risk of something like that happening, and that will really escalate things. But looking at this, I don't think it's been entirely peaceful. For example, there was guests going to the White House Correspondents' Dinner in Washington, D.C., and they were harassed as they went there, ostensibly for no other reason. They represent the press, and they were going to be in company with the president. Now that's, it's bad PR. I think all protest movements need to be responsible, and I'm not sure that this has been entirely responsible. Now, one of the key things that's brought up in all of this is the allegations of anti-Semitism, and I want to talk a bit about that as I see it. I think unquestionably since a Hamas attack last year, there has been pockets of anti-Semitism. I don't think anyone could just pretend that hasn't happened. There has been virulently anti-Semitic, that is, anti-Jewish statements on posters, and de facto, there has been hate crimes against Jews on both sides of the Atlantic, and that's a disgrace. And when Jews say they feel fear for their safety, that has to be taken seriously. The recent exchange in London between Gideon Falter of the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism is a useful talking point around this. Now, what exactly happened? This video wasn't going to be primarily about that incident, so I'm just going to touch on it. But basically, Gideon Falter, Jewish man, was stopped from crossing the street, ostensibly for his own safety. The police officer said, "Sir, you look visibly Jewish," and the implication was they were trying to protect him because he would have been confronted by the pro-Palestinian rally. Now, in subsequent interviews and so on, this is not quite what meets the eye, because the other side has said, actually, he's a campaigner himself. He's every right to campaign against anti-Semitism, but whilst the officer's use of words was clumsy, the implication for me is not so much that they were stopping him from crossing the street. It's more the implication that the officer felt himself that he would be targeted because he was Jewish. Now, ironically, the other side has said, no, that's a smear on us, because we have many Jews on these rallies. And it is one thing that has to be observed. Among the pro-Palestinians, there's unquestionably been pro-Hamas elements. Now, to be absolutely clear, I have no time for pro-Hamas elements at all. Anyone who says that the deliberate targeting of civilians is a legitimate act of resistance is deluded. It's callous to, the many hostages that are still out there. It's callous to the thousands of grieving relatives, and it does go into the thousands when you add up the families of all those killed on October the 7th. That was a brazen terrorist attack. Hamas are not freedom fighters, they're thugs, Islamist terrorists, and they've caused enormous suffering in the Gaza Strip as well in peacetime with their brutal Sharia law. So I have absolutely no time for Hamas. I do not see them as a legitimate resistant force. And I think pro-Palestinians that portray them that way are not helping their own case. But, and this is a big but, I also believe that there are right-wing pro-Israelis in Israel, in Britain, in America, that will try to silence debate by smearing anyone who criticizes Israel as an anti-Semite or as pro-Hamas. This is absurd. And one reason it's absurd is among the rallies there have been Jewish voices. To what extent is a matter of debate. They have been there. There have been absolutely Jews, Holocaust survivors among them, who have criticised Netanyahu's government. Within Israel itself, there have been heavy protests against Netanyahu's government. So I think some Jewish people do take the arrogant notion that because they're waving an Israeli flag, they alone are the voice of Judaism. That's arrogant. Any community of people is going to have a plurality of opinion, just like no one Muslim can say they represent the whole community. No one Jew can claim they represent the whole community. So I think that needs to be highlighted. There are Jews who are anti-Israel. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to agree with every component of the marches. I'm sure no Jew would agree with sympathy for Hamas or anti-Semitic tropes. but it does somewhat counter the narrative that this is entirely anti-Semitic. I think at times when you have had, particularly on this side of the Atlantic, where there has been Islamist voices praising Hamas, it certainly hasn't helped things. And I do believe the Metropolitan Police have not been consistent in that regard. I appreciate it's not an easy thing to do. The resources that is spent, the officers having to come off their off days to police this. It's not easy, but I don't believe they've been entirely consistent. I do believe there's been times where the police have thought it favourable to kind of tell Jewish people, oh, well, better avoid trouble rather than apprehending troublemakers. I think also the response between the police in the UK and the US has been different. Which side's more successful is a matter of debate. I think both sides have had problems. I will say this. Being absolutely honest, I have a lot less sympathy for Israel today than I did on October the 7th. I maintain that October the 7th was an abomination, and I maintain that it would have been inconceivable for Netanyahu's government to not take action after that. He would have been expected to, and any government in the world would have taken action against this worst ever terror attack. I defy any government to claim otherwise. The problem is, rather than just going after Hamas, I really, really believe at this point, despite what Israel says, it is really looking at collective punishment. And whilst Hamas does have a genocidal intent in its charter, we have seen the literal destruction of Gaza. Literally. There's no functioning hospital. Thousands of civilians have been killed, including, disgracefully, thousands of children. Over 100 journalists, over 100 aid workers. Now, some pro-Israelis just seem mute to that. They just seem to not care. And I've heard the argument, well, the Allies bombed German cities during World War II and killed civilians. Well, there's a few things with that. Firstly, it was 80 years ago, more than 80 years ago. Secondly, it was in the context of a global war. But even if you say, okay, there's going to be civilians die in any military campaign, the extent of civilian death in this is really unconscionable. And I don't think it's good enough to say, oh, well, it happened in the past, so that just excuses everything Israel is doing today. How, for example, do you justify targeting a clearly marked aid convoy? That's, I think there's no justification for that. Israel needs to explain how they get that confused with Hamas fighters, including, by the way, 3 British civilians among the dead. I do think that there's a desensitization. I do think there's a dehumanization of the Palestinians from some pro-Israeli elements, hard right-wingers in the West. They just think, oh, well, they're just... I do think they sort of see them as expendable. And I hate this ghastly term, collateral damage, which I've heard. As if, oh, well, 40 people have died in an airstrike today, entire families wiped out. It's unfortunate, but it's collateral damage. That argument is becoming very thin because I really do think Israel is losing enormous support around the world. And even Israel's allies in London and Washington, D.C. are finding it increasingly hard to be vocally supportive of Israel. Now, when Iran attacked Israel, Iran has no business being involved in this. I think Iran has a toxic influence in the region. Iran isn't doing this to defend the Palestinians. Iran is doing this because Iran itself is anti-Israel. Most Iranians don't want their government to be involved. Indeed, most Iranians know full well that this is a government that tortures and kills its own people. So I think Iranian influence on the region is toxic, and the fact that no one died in their drone strikes doesn't mean anything other than it was a successful counter operation by Israel and Israel's allies. Make no mistake, if though any of those drones had got through, Israel would have seen hundreds of casualties with those attacks. So, I think Iran's a toxic influence in the region. But I do have a big problem with this idea that if anyone expresses concern about the situation in Gaza, they're anti-Israel or they're pro-Hamas or pro... just got a little startle there, a moth appeared on my laptop. Reducing the argument that way is lazy. That is no better than saying criticising Islamic extremism is Islamophobia. Well, I think that there is anti-Muslim prejudice out there. I think there's definitely anti-Semitism out there. But that doesn't mean that every debate should be shut down by smearing people with those terms when it doesn't apply. If it is a clear-cut case, if someone is coming out with anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, that's anti-Semitism. If someone is, expressing hatred of all Muslims, that's I don't particularly like the term Islamophobia, but that's anti-Muslim bigotry. Now, that's what I'm noticing with this. People are getting so tribalized. I can't think of any other conflict that is this polarized, including Ukraine. Yet there's other wars going on in the world. This year there's been some fierce fighting in Burma. The rebels there have pushed back against the Tatmadaw. That really should be a major news item, and it's been relegated to the sidelines. Sudan, it's highly likely that the true death toll is a lot higher than 15,000. Yemen and Syria are far from over. They're very bleak situations, far from over. The Haiti crisis may as well be classed as a war now. So Gaza is far from the only war in the world, and of course Ukraine. It's speculated Putin may push a big spring offensive whilst the world's looking at Gaza. So I do somewhat question why. Now, I know some of the pro-Palestinians are Palestinian or Arab, so they have personal interests. But I do wonder why others have such a fixation, particularly on that conflict. Why, for example, did they not speak out against Bashar Assad raining down barrel bombs on Syrian civilians? By all means, criticise Israel, but there is a lack of consistency there, and I do think that needs to be questioned. So I'm just going to conclude here. Regarding the protests, I feel some of the police response seems a bit heavy-handed, but peaceful protest does not mean getting to hijack universities and just stopping other students and faculty members going about their business. Any expressions of pro-Hamas sentiments or anti-Semitism absolutely should be confronted. But it's wrong to dismiss the protests as all being that way, particularly when there's Jewish students involved. There has to be freedom to criticise Israel. I mean, when there's been so many deaths of children, how anyone could be okay with the situation is beyond me. I think you'd have to be made of stone to be okay with that. And I think Western outlets need to be more vocal about the number of journalists who have died. I do feel at this point, if we continue funding Israel without any sort of red lines, that's going to seriously damn our reputation. At this point, if I was Rishi Sunak, I'd be saying, we're seriously going to put this on hold, or at least review it. Israel should not be just given a blank slate. By all means, condemn terrorist attacks on Israel, but I think part of the problem here is Netanyahu's just banking on British and American support. And too much of the time, frankly, British and American governments give it blanket support. Ironically, in the past, the two governments that stopped funding Israel temporarily was Thatcher in 1982 and Blair in 2002. So there is a precedent. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. But I do feel depressed about the situation. It's horrible out there. Any peace deal has to acknowledge that Hamas has a genocidal charter against Israel, but I am not convinced that Israel is doing everything in its power to prevent the level of suffering. I don't think there's any justification for the total destruction of Gaza, for the total destruction of hospitals. They say that they check flour lorries when they go in. I know that some of those lorries have been attacked. The Egyptian drivers have been attacked. So, who is doing that? That has to be questioned. Is it Palestinian militants? This war is not black and white, but one thing is sure. Anyone who says that there's no suffering in Gaza is a liar. And I think some Hebrew language sources are spreading lies about this. And the hard right is lapping it up. There is absolutely a humanitarian crisis there. And anyone with any notion of common sense can see it. Let me know your thoughts.